Yeah,
You feel like that?
I feel like that.
Good stuff. So we're having issues coming up with a good intro for this movie that we're doing this week.
Telling you, man, just make the bird noises.
Yeah, just make the bird noises. I was telling my co-host Greg that they dead ass paid somebody to sit in the studio and just make like sexual bird noises. You know, I like imagine him as like a middle-aged balding man just going into the mic. So let's get this show on the road. Welcome,
Yeah.
welcome, welcome, friends, family, and Locknars. Today we are covering 1981's Heavy Metal. Now this is an animated film, and I don't even know where to begin with this. So
Oh,
let's
man.
just dive right into our notes.
Yep.
The 1980s were a time of hair metal, cocaine, and the early rise of the popularization of animated films. So the general premise of the movie is that Heavy Metal as a movie weaves many smaller stories together with an overarching story of this Lochnar. And the Lochnar is a floating space orb that corrupts men's hearts and it also disintegrates them. Super awesome.
Yep.
So it was directed by Gerald Potterton. It was produced by Ivan Reitman and Leonard Mogul. So this movie was trying to portray what was essentially the feel and the actual comics of the Heavy Metal magazine, and thus the name. So we kind of chose this out of the blue. It came across my desk one morning, and we went into this thing blind. I only saw the trailer, and I don't think you saw anything, did you?
Nope.
All right, let's talk some good stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about cultural impacts, and like I said prior, that this movie weaves many smaller stories into one big overarching story that's 90 minutes.
Yep.
We're going to go over some of those stories, and we're going to go over kind of the plot of each one, and then we're going to talk like significance and like metaphors and symbolism, shit like that. So the first two we're combining into one. The first one is Soft Landing, which portrays Mr. Spaceman coming down with this rockin' soundtrack in his space Corvette, descending into an unnamed planet, and that serves as the intro to the movie. And then the following story called Grimaldi, it is where we are introduced to the Lochnar. And the Lochnar in this particular story is described as the sum of all evils, right?
Yeah.
So we get glimpses where the father brings home the Lochnar in the case and he unleashes it, kills the father, and then he starts cornering the girl. And then the Lochnar states that this girl is innocent, she's pure, and once I defeat her, once I disintegrate her, there will be nothing left to stop me.
Yeah.
What did you think of these two first stories?
I think it's a pretty kick-ass way to kick off a movie. Obviously, you have the Corvette flying down from space onto the unknown planet, and with a kick-ass soundtrack, and then the first death of the whole film actually happens where this dude just gets literally melted into nothing, and then obviously, yeah, the whole Lochnar thing. But I think it was pretty decent. You know, I caught my attention right off the bat, especially like since this short story actually kind of weaves together and kind of revolves around.
Wraps back around.
Yeah, wraps back around. It pretty much revolves like
I think
everything
Soft
else.
Landing as a whole, in addition to Grimaldi, obviously, because we're combining them for the sake of this podcast,
Yeah.
I think it does a really good job at kind of setting the pace and the tone of the movie because you go into it, obviously we didn't see this in 81, we weren't around back then, but I think going into the movie we didn't know what to expect, and just the blaring guitar and there's just this badass space vehicle descending. There's something special about the imagery and kind of the soundtrack choice of this movie. We'll talk soundtrack later.
Yeah.
But I think you know that you're strapped in for the next 85 minutes. That is going to be a fucking trip. And I think it just such a good job tonally at setting that up.
You know where Grimaldi actually came from?
Where did it come from?
They're actually Toon Sound guys. They're brothers. Their last name were Grimaldi. So
Awesome.
We just ended up naming that segment from them.
And of course, this is our intro story. So we set up the most important character, well, the two most important characters, the daughter and the Lochnar. And the Lochnar is going to be the interweaving thing between all the stories. The next one we get is Harry Canyon. And now when I was looking at this movie, I thought this was going to be the whole story. I thought this movie was about Harry Canyon. But
Same.
It's essentially New York in 2031. We're actually not too far away from that.
Yeah.
And it is corrupt. It is dirty, it is stinky, and we follow a taxi cab driver by the name of Harry Canyon. And he's just going around doing his daily thing until one day this woman shows up and she's being chased by mobsters. So the cab driver gives her a ride, and it turns out she is in possession of an ancient alien artifact known as the Lochnar. Good stuff. So he sleeps with her, and the woman decides to sell the Lochnar. They meet up the mobsters, they sell it. She hops back in the car. She points a gun at his head, and she says she's taking the money. He disintegrates her, and then it comes back to the mobsters. They release the Lochnar, and then they get disintegrated as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very kind of simple premise of a taxi cab driver, a man in the mundane who's going about his daily kind of ritual and routine and is disrupted by this force of greatness, really. I mean, the Lochnar is this, it is set up at this point to be this sort of great
Power.
thing. Yeah, this great power, and it just kind of descends upon him, disrupting his daily.
Getting out of the rut.
Absolutely. There we go. I couldn't have said it any better.
Yeah.
And I think the hilariousness of this story is that these events transpire between probably 2 days, right? And the whole time we're thinking that, wow, he won't have to be a cabbie, or like maybe he'll like turn around and be this like awesome fucking hero. You know what I mean? And this is like the turning point in his life. But he gets the score of the money, the entire thing at the end of the skit, and then he just goes back to being a cabbie, and it's like nothing changed. And I think that's hilarious, and I think that kind of shows that humans are like habitual creatures.
Yeah. What comes around goes around.
Good stuff. What do you think about this stuff, man? Do you think I'm totally reaching here? Because I mean, I do totally reach sometimes.
No, yeah, no. Like, I think this short story pretty much sums up like how we go about our daily life here and there, and then sometimes that one thing just comes out of nowhere and sidetracks us. But at the end of the day, we end up still going to our daily routine, whether or not we want to. I mean, sometimes we might get away with the win, like in this case, yeah, you got the money, but it's just a kind of like a addition to his life. He still goes back to being a cab driver, so who knows?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that this particular skit, I keep calling them skits, this particular story kind of flips these character roles
Yeah.
and these stereotypes on its head, because we get like the damsel in distress, right? And then we get the mobsters are pretty much the same. And then we get this kind of hero slash anti-hero that wants nothing to do with anything, blah, blah, blah. And the damsel in distress really, she was in distress for like 5 or 10 minutes while she was being chased. And then she turns around and becomes the villain
Yeah.
at the end of the story. She becomes the two-timer. And then I think the cab driver ploy is just so great. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. The next one's called Den. We got a lot of thoughts about this one. So Den is a story about how a young man discovered this green meteorite, hint, hint, in his backyard. He brought it into his room, and during an electrical storm, it struck the green meteorite, and it transported him into the land of Neverwhere.
Yeah.
And this kid is now a massive
He-Man.
built He-Man, also bald, right?
Yeah, out of nowhere.
So, this one's kind of a weird one. He goes through the land of Neverwhere, and he, bumps into like this human sacrifice thing, blah, blah, blah. Let's dive right into it, because I think this is the point in the movie where things really start getting weird.
Yeah.
What'd you think of this story, man? I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, so I think this kind of portrays the whole, because this kid's a nerd.
Yeah,
right?
okay. Yeah, I forgot
Yeah.
to set that up.
Yeah, so this kid's a nerd, and he gets transported into this like into Neverwhere, and he's pretty much goes from being literally a nobody to like this
From zero to hero.
from zero to hero, pretty much. Like, he gets the damsel, he sleeps with 2 different women, they ride dragonflies and whatnot,
He slays monsters.
slays monsters, and he just becomes this like big hulking thing. And I feel like this whole story kind of revolves around how at the time, nerdy people, they kind of wanted to be that type of dude. They wanted to be that jock, they wanted to be that big hero, but there's no way, they obviously they can't be, because they're just these scrawny shits. And this kind of portrays like, hey, what if that actually did happen?
Yeah. So what I wrote down is I think it very much fulfills kind of the male fantasy aspect of the thing, because I think a good chunk of males, especially in like the 80s, and I'm not making generalizations here, it's just based off what we saw in the movie, is I think everybody kind of wants to be powerful, and every male kind of wants to be desired by the opposite sex. And this takes a character and totally flips it on his head. It gives him the exact opposite. It gives him essentially everything he wants.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And I think that's perfectly portrayed when he gets interrupted while trying to have sex with the first woman, and they're like, "Well, we need her for sacrifice. She needs to be a virgin," and blah blah blah. And he's like, "Oh, come on, blah blah blah."
Yeah.
I think it's kind of funny that he sort of loses himself in the fantasy.
Yeah.
And now where the Lochnar ties into this story is that the Lochnar is the sacrificial orb, or the thing that they're sacrificing it to.
Well, I think they're using it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're
using
saying no. Yeah, they're sacrificing the chick to the orb. to
Yeah.
summon this like whatever the hell was in the water.
Interesting role in this one, and I think at the end he decides to stay. He does not want to go back to Earth.
No.
Good stuff.
And then
Yeah, go ahead.
this also kind of empower like with the whole empowered woman thing, because you have the queen is actually like a chick and she rules over the whole land, all these orcs and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. She
So
controls a whole army, and she could be absolutely devastating.
yeah,
Good stuff. Let's talk about probably my favorite story. This next one's called Captain Stern. So Captain Stern is a story about a intergalactic war general, something along those
space
lines.
captain.
Yeah, captain. Going to court to essentially testify for all these like atrocities that he's committed and
It
stuff.
was 12 counts of murder on the first degree, 14 counts of armed theft of Federation property, 22 counts of piracy in high space, 18 counts of fraud, 37 counts of rape, and 1 moving violation.
Yeah, I think that moving violation's fucking great.
Yeah.
And so the premise of the story is that Captain Stern is on trial, and he calls up a kind of a witness to give his like character testimony. And Hanover Fist is the witness's name, and he bumps into the Lochnar, which is shrunken down into like this marble-sized thing, and Stern has paid Hanover to say, yeah, he's a nice guy, this and that. He's a great person. He wouldn't hurt a fly, right?
Yeah.
But he gets up on stand, and the Lochnar essentially makes him give the truth about Captain Stern and how he's a terrible fucking person.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, Hanover Fist turns into this hulking, raging monster like the tank from Left 4 Dead. And he begins to just chase everybody down and just destroy stuff. And I thought that was absolutely hilarious. It came
His
out of the
main
blue.
goal was to obviously kill Captain Stern. Like, you just wanted to pummel his ass.
Yeah, good stuff. And the story wraps up with the Lochnar falling out of Hanover Fist's jacket or pocket, something like that. And he still gets the money at the end of the day. And
Well, he gets ejected into space, but the Lochnar stays in Hanover Fist's hand while it like plummets down into like whatever planet they were above.
good stuff, good stuff. So my kind of thought process on the Captain Stern stuff was that the Lochnar is kind of drawn to corruption here because we had corruption at play before the Lochnar was even arriving, right? We see it get to this space station, this space court, right?
Yeah.
And we can safely assume that Hanover Fist has been already paid off by Stern. He was on his way to testify, right, to give his testimonial. And so my thought process here is that the Lochnar was drawn to this stuff, and it's drawn to the corruption of men's hearts as we were, as that information was given to us in the first story. And so I think what the Lochnar did here was it sort of amplified all that craziness, all that corruption.
Yeah.
And it made Hanover Fist go absolutely bananas.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, Captain Stern is that embodiment of the corruption. At the end of the day, even though the Lochnar just kind of played a role into it, like the main dude, Stern in this case, still won because
Yeah,
he still got away from the court and he still got his money back, even though, yeah, he's got his money back. So he pretty much won at the end of the day.
good
Like
stuff.
the corruption pretty much won.
Yeah, the Lochnar didn't cause the corruption because that was clearly going on before it even got there. It was merely drawn to it and amplified it, like I said.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good story, and I do love the I got an angle, I got an angle. I think that's an
I
excellent
got an
quote.
angle.
Good stuff. Talk to me about B-17.
So this is my favorite of all the stories.
Yeah,
so
we know.
yeah. So B-17 is basically, it starts off in a World War II B-17 bomber nicknamed the Pacific Pearl, and it's making this giant like bombing run. And during the bombing run, it gets hit by a bunch of flak, bunch of shrapnel, and I believe all the crew except besides pretty much the pilot and the co-pilot are dead. So one of the pilots goes back to the cockpit, like in the back, and then he sees the Lochnar trailing the bomber. And so he notifies the main pilot that the Lochnar is trailing them, and they both start freaking out. And then the Lochnar actually ends up kind of getting onto the plane and lighting everything up. And it was a weird experience. So the co-pilot starts heading back up, and pretty much everybody that died in the B-17 at that point started rising from the dead, essentially zombies. And so they start attacking the plane. The co-pilot, I believe, dies, and then the plane itself crashes on. No, the actual pilot parachutes off the plane and then goes down into an island. And then while he's walking, he sees a bunch of other downed planes, and zombies start rising from there. And unfortunately, that pilot meets his fate. And so, what at least I saw, first of all, this is my favorite short story because the level of detail in this is amazing. From the grotesque zombies to the actual flak to the deaths to the island, everything like the animation was amazing, and then the drawings. But what I'm stemming from this is that this movie was released in '81. We were in the midst of a Cold War, so this was obviously anti-war propaganda. That no soldier wins at the end of the day, and pretty much obviously like this is just anti-war propaganda. But also, I feel that especially with the zombies, that like act of war kind of stays with each like kind of current war going on. Like you saw those zombies; those were like previous dead soldiers.
Yeah, there was a
So
whole graveyard of.
yeah, but giant graveyard. So right now it was the Cold War, and then it's just like it's the same thing with the Vietnam War. It was the same thing with World War II. It's like it's pretty much I feel like a purgatory that each soldier is kind of stuck in when it comes to this, because it's always the same outcome.
Good
People
stuff.
die.
Good stuff. I appreciate all the good information you bring into this podcast. And in addition to that, these stories came out before the movie, obviously, and this movie took a very long time to produce.
Yep.
And so we kind of also figured that this was like anti-Vietnam propaganda. In addition to that,
Yeah.
because we do see it lands in like a jungle, like a heavily like forested area. Well, forested is probably a bad word, but it is like a jungly area.
Like an island jungle, yeah.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, B-17, I think what it does really well, it shows kind of the visceral side of animation that maybe all these other ones didn't touch on. Well, we've seen the people get disintegrated by the Lochnar, but we didn't see this sort of level of violence and brutality where you see the layers peel back on like a human face.
Yeah.
And kind of the tragedy of war. I thought it was awesome, actually.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Let's talk about the next one. So beautiful and so dangerous. So the setup for this one is that we have a spaceship from an alien planet hovering over the Pentagon, and they are space truckers, and they abduct an Earth woman, and the robot sleeps with her. Anyway, they're piloting out to wherever, and this is a very like typical Clerks setup where like most of the fun stuff is between the dialogue and the shenanigans that happen before they accomplish anything really, because all they do is abduct her, and then they go to this massive spaceport, and it wraps up. I thought this one was like sheer goofiness. I loved it. It brought, I don't want to say it didn't bring anything of value to the table because comedy itself is a value. I just thought that this is a phenomenal example of what happens when you give the writing team just like full creativity and they could just make whatever they want.
Free will.
Good stuff. Good stuff. What was the quote we really liked from there?
So he was trying to go into the spaceport and they sniffed a bunch of like space cocaine and tripped out balls in the cosmos.
He's like, you gotta adjust for it, right?
He said, he's like, oh man, are you sure you can land this thing? And he's like, nah, yeah, man, you're like, your perception of reality is so fucked. You just pretty much gotta roll with it. Or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's absolutely great. And so these next two, Tarna and the epilogue, we're going to sort of combine them because it only makes sense to. Tarna is a story about an alien race that sees the Lochnar crash into a volcano. That volcano spews hot molten lava, and they begin to kind of
morph into these green-skinned beings that pretty much hate every human on the planet.
And they start to go all-out war. And what we see is these four elders of the civilization locked up in some sort of temple where they're praying to a Tarnakian. And it essentially goes, well, do you really believe that Tarnakians exist? And one of them's like, yes, we just have to like pray to them or we have to call to them and they'll show up.
Yeah.
And so those four men die, but we see the first shining example of the woman that is on the cover of Heavy Metal, the Tarnakian. She comes into play on this massive bird pterodactyl thing and starts fucking up these aliens.
Yeah.
Absolutely destroying them, going to like a full-fledged bar fight and all this good stuff. How did you feel about this one, man?
I think, well, first of all, that whole like when they prayed like the whole ritual thing.
It's kind of sad, wasn't it?
Huh?
It was kind of sad, wasn't it?
It was sad, but at the same time, that like that Tarnakian took like quite a sweet time swimming through that pool and putting on her armor, and I'm just sitting there like these guys are pretty much goners at this point because she had to fly still and whatnot. But no, I mean I thoroughly enjoyed this short story. I like how badass she was. She pretty much cut off the green people's heads or whatever in the bar because they fucked around with her, and at the end of the day, she still beat the baddie with her bird getting speared. That made me sad too when the bird got speared. I felt so bad for that.
Absolutely. And so when we cut back to when we get to the epilogue is essentially the first story with that little girl that we mentioned, and so she becomes the Tarnakian.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of touch base with we mentioned it previously in the Den story, but this is super awesome. I mean, we get hints and like tastes that this girl is special, but like by the point in the movie where we hit the Tarnakian stuff, you totally kind of forget about everything else, and you're lost in the sauce, so to say, right?
Yep.
And to come back around and make that little girl the next Tarnakian because her heart is uncorrupted and defeat the Lochnar. I love that. I love the whole empowering women thing because we got to see a lot of like the male fantasy, especially with stories like Den and
So Beautiful, So Dangerous.
yeah, absolutely. And stuff like B-17 shows like the horrors of what men can do to each other, right?
Yeah.
And then we get to the saving grace, which is a woman is the one to save us all and defeat the Lochnar that's been causing all this stuff. And I think that's very empowering, and I think that's fucking excellent.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of line of thought was so progressive for 1981, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff. Love it. You got any thoughts on that?
No, you actually just wrapped it up.
Good stuff. Let's talk about. Let's get back to the movie as a whole. Talk to me about your next point.
So this movie obviously touched base with the stoner scene, at least in my opinion. You have trippy visuals throughout the whole movie. You have stories that deal with the stoner, in this case, So Beautiful and So Dangerous, where the aliens are tripping balls through the cosmos. And you have a metal soundtrack, which at the time I feel like was associated with the stoner scene. And overall, the whole movie seemed like this giant whole trip, and it made no sense, but then somehow made sense, and it just blew your whole mind.
Yeah, it takes you along for the ride.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of a movie you might want to see stoned, and
Yeah.
I think that propagates Greg's point even further. I do think it did a really good job of like encompassing like this weirdness about it and shit like that. And to say that it is a stoner movie is fitting, but to say that it is also a like metal movie and a animated movie, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It fits so many different like social circles in that regards.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned metal, and the movie is entitled Heavy Metal. So I want to talk about the soundtrack for a little bit.
Yep.
And I have the whole damn thing listed here. We have Heavy Metal by Sammy Hagar, performed by Don Felder. We got Heartbeat by Riggs, Working in the Coal Mine by Devo, Veteran of the Psychic Wars by Blue Oyster Cult, Reach Out by Cheap Trick, Heavy Metal by Don Felder, True Companion, Donald Fagen, Crazy by Nazareth, Radar Rider Riggs, Open Arms Journey, Queen Bee, Grand Funk Railroad, I Must Be Dreamin' by Cheap Trick, The Mob Rules by Black Sabbath, the alternative version, by the way, All of You by Don Felder, Prefabricated by Trust, and Blue Lamp by Stevie Nicks. This is a fucking prime example of what a good soundtrack for a movie looks like.
Yep.
And these are all hand-selected songs. The directors for this movie knew exactly what they wanted, because I think it's one thing to cherry pick 14 songs. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You and I could do that for whatever we wanted to do, and I'm sure we'd come up with a different list every single time we went on it, right? But it's using these segments of these 3, 4, 5 minute long songs to fit it to the theme of the scene and the movie and overall. And I think that the music in this really propagated a level of badassness. It added to the visual effects. It added to this kind of weird story. And I don't know, man, just the metal scene in this time loans itself very nicely to this sort of abstraction that is 1981's heavy metal.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Let's talk about the animation.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of heavy rotoscoping was used. And so for those of you who don't know, rotoscoping is the process of taking a model and actors and then tracing the shot onto film for animation purposes. And we saw a lot of that done. Fun fact, the ending scene was shot in quote unquote like live action, and it was never transcribed into animation because they were running out of time. The movie got bumped up from October, November of 1981 to August of 1981. So that's why. In addition to that, I think the animation it's not the greatest, if we're being honest here, and I don't think it held up particularly well. But I do think that is the kind of charm of this movie, where it is sort of this goofy, outdated looking movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we saw in 1989, granted 8 years later, we saw Akira, which was beautiful, and that movie holds up well. You know, it's painted fucking wondrously. And then you look at like the American attempt 8 years prior at 1981's heavy metal. and it looks like it's running at 30 frames per second.
Yeah.
But I think it did a really good job of, like you said earlier, capturing the feel of the heavy metal magazines.
Hmm.
It had this layer of like dirt and grit on it. And I think if you were reading heavy metal in that time period, this is kind of exactly what you wanted.
Hmm.
You wanted this unpolished movie, and you wanted this unpolished feel that looks like it's, in your older brother's bedroom that's in the basement that he hasn't vacuumed for like 6 months.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was that stoner appealed to it. And I think because it looks so outdated and choppy and slow, I think that that's what makes it fun and quirky at times.
Yeah.
Because when the movie booted up, I was like, wow, this movie did not age well. But as we got into it, I think that became less and less of a problem.
Yeah.
What do you got to say about the animation? Did you like it? Did you hate it?
Well, like you stated, I feel like it didn't really hold up well because, come on, that sword chop that in that what was it, the Tarna, like that in that scene.
Oh, yeah, that
with the-
sword swing
dude,
took
that sword,
forever.
yeah, man, it was like 15 frames per second or something. But I mean, on YouTube, I've seen like some of these animations, like something close to this. Might have been Heavy Metal magazine too, like maybe some different animation. But this animation, in my opinion, holds a special place, at least whenever I see it in like my heart, because I don't know, man. It makes it something about it just makes it so unique, and like the world that like it pretty much portrays and it creates. It's just amazing. Like I always love like even though yeah, like you look at it and be like, oh wow, it's so shitty. I still actually like this animation, and it like I said, it's unique. Makes it works for this stuff with the magazine and whatnot, and it just pretty much gives this movie like a whole different level.
I think it adds a lot of character to it, and I think we're on
Yeah.
the same page of that.
Yeah.
Because now I do associate this kind of weird rotoscoped, kind of funky looking animation with 1981's heavy metal. It
Yeah.
is really a quirk at the end of the day,
Hmm.
and I love it. So, big thing, let's talk about it. What do you think made this movie such a cult hit? Because it did 20.1 million at the box office, and it costed roughly 9 million to make. So it did make some profit. It wasn't like a blockbuster or anything.
Hmm.
But what do you think made it so fun? Because there is a cult following for this film.
Yeah. I have a couple points on this. So
Sure.
obviously the soundtrack, because you have stuff like Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath, Sammy Hagar, and they're all phenomenal artists, and they really added to this whole movie. The whole drug scene at the time was pretty active, and this movie did a good job reflecting on it as well as kind of enhancing it. Because if you do watch the movie like High on Campus or whatever, uh, then yeah,
More on that in a bit.
yeah, it would enhance it like tenfold. And Heavy Metal magazine was pretty big at the time, and seeing that on the big screen probably was just like amazing for people,
For all the
especially like
readers.
yeah, especially like the young audience because nudity and violence was on there, and most people were probably super young at the time seeing this, and it was just like, oh wow, like an animation with tits and blood and gore, and you just got all giddy, probably half chub in that fucking theater right now, just pulling it right there, and
All right, Pee Wee Herman, calm down.
yeah, and honestly, the movie was actually a good translation and of the mood and feel of the comment. Plus, in my opinion, it had an all-star cast writing the movie and producing it. It had like 7 studios, pretty much like doing the animations and whatnot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
talk to me about who wrote it, because I didn't actually look too deep into this, and then you mentioned it before we started recording.
So this is he wrote some of the short stories. So Dan O'Bannon wrote a couple of the short stories for the movie, mainly B-17 and Soft Landing, which is the intro sequence. And I was actually pretty stoked about this. He was the person that wrote the first Alien film and wrote and directed at least my favorite zombie movie, Return of the Living Dead, as well as Total Recall.
Awesome. Yeah, so
Yeah.
those are actually blockbusters.
Yeah.
And we got to see him do 2 pieces for this movie.
Yeah.
Good stuff. In regards to the cult film, you know me, man. I'm big on soundtrack. We did, for our 3rd episode of this podcast, we did Jet Set Radio Future. And I think the big appeal behind that game is this, like, funky jazzcore, electro, hip-hop soundtrack. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that worked really well for the setting of Neo Tokyo. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas this is this weird, outlandish, Americanized version of like a space. I wouldn't even call it a Western. It's like a space odyssey, really, at the end of the day. And I think the heavy metal sound and it just works well for the purpose of this film. Like I said, they did such a good job at tackling the soundtrack.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of my main point because, I mean, the soundtrack still fucking holds up today. There's no doubts about that. The animation is a thing of its own, but I think it was a combination of things that came together, and it was honestly lightning in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Because we haven't watched the 2000s heavy metal remake or sequel, whatever it is.
Most people say don't watch it.
Yeah, I read the same thing. Most people say don't watch it, which is rather unfortunate. All right, so you brought some extra goodies to the table. Talk to me.
So a couple like spin-off like mentions of the film are kind of like fun facts. South Park actually kind of did a little homage to the film in their episode Major Boobage. This is the episode where Kenny gets high on cat urine and has a heavy metal type hallucination. And again, this whole ties in the whole drug side stoner scene the movie had going. So he basically like takes like the cat urine and he just tits. He's actually in that like roads like the Corvette in space and drives down on the planet, pretty much mirroring Soft Landing from Heavy Metal. And yeah, he just comes up to this palace. The palace is made of metal tits, and yeah, he just
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, and he pretty much meets this woman and they start fighting shit. So it was a nice little homage to the film. I kind of enjoyed that. And this is the biggest. Put your tinfoil hats on. Elon Musk might have been a huge fan of this movie because his Tesla and with Starman on it that launched in February 6, 2018 is nearly identical to the Corvette with the astronaut aboard the opening segment Soft Landing. So it was kind of like something brought into reality. And it's kind of also weird that this happened in 2018 and the movie came out in 1981. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
kind
funny.
of a weird thing.
And they the setting for Harry Cannon was 2031, so they were only how many years off? 13 years off.
13 years off, yeah.
13 years off. That's not too bad for a movie that predicted 50 years in the future.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So, any closing questions, comments, or concerns? What did you think about the movie? We didn't talk about that. Did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed it, but the night we watched it and I went home, I was still trying to decipher the whole film because it was like they had me in the beginning with the whole orb and the kid and whatnot, and then they had these short stories, and the short stories became more bizarre, and then B-17 happened, and I was like, okay, like this is cool, and then even more bizarre short stories, and then it just all wraps around, like basically
It gives you this weird
yeah
animation omelet, right?
yeah the beginning it was like oh yeah like it was pretty much saying like oh yeah the beginning sequence yeah this ties into the whole thing like somehow, and I'm just like what the fuck, like maybe you were right, I should have maybe smoked some fucking White Widow or something like that before I watched this.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think that first night we both didn't really know what to say in regards to this movie. I think this movie took a lot of time to digest and to process in our minds, but once I decided that I do like it, I'm totally on board, man. I think I totally understand the cultness and the following of this movie.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's what's most important at the end of the day. You can watch a movie, maybe not understand it, but as long as you like it, and a lot of people seem to like this movie, hop on the train.
Yeah, watch the movie, watch it high. Just letting you know, expLOREation podcast does not condone the use of drugs.
Good stuff, good stuff. So, as every episode goes, please check us out on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram. What else we got out there?
Facebook? Did you say Facebook?
Yeah, I said Facebook. YouTube. We're on YouTube as
Yeah,
well.
YouTube.
Check us out on Podbean,
Stitcher Radio.
Stitcher Radio, Overcast Radio, anywhere where podcasts are found.
Yes.
Do that thing.
We what we do. We keep the lore in expLOREation. Catch you on the flip side. Lochnar.